Good day, everyone. Welcome to what is technically the first episode of the Girls Frontline Summary Series. I'll take the chance right now to state what this summary series aims to do. This is supposed to be an alternative means to learn about Girls Frontline 1. While Girls Frontline 2 does a good job adding context to Girls Frontline 1 in a natural way, people are naturally going to be curious. The problem is Girls Frontline 1 is notoriously difficult to play through, and it requires a lot of time and dedication. That may not be something people are willing to dive into. This series is supposed to alleviate that. While I will always believe the best way to experience a story is to read it yourself, I will be doing my best to provide this summary as a storyteller, so it may get a little dramatic at times. That said, I will be leaving out anything that I deem purely superfluous. This is why, while comprehensive, this is a summary and not a retelling. If you deem this unsatisfactory, there are more ways to learn about the story. There are two websites that pretty much gives you the game script. There's watching cutscenes online. The Girls Frontline fanbase has also wrote approximately 300 pages worth of comprehensive details. Links for all of these methods are in the description. Episode 0 will focus purely on the history of Girls Frontline, and Episode 1 will focus on Arc 1 of the story. Episode 2 and onwards will focus purely on the events afterward. Now sit back and let's get started. The spark behind this story was Relic research. As the name implies, Relic research is the study of lost or ancient technology that is of unknown origin. Therefore, the story ultimately asks and explores this question: what would the world be like if we were handed technology that rivaled the gods? The United States and the Soviet Union were the primary nations that were pushing Relic research as far as it could go. This started as far back as the year 1905, where the Russians initially discovered Relic technology. This gave them a pretty significant head start, as the United States only began to discover Relic technology in 1955. This made the Cold War become an arms race of Relic technology instead of nukes. This would eventually lead to weapons being tested during the Vietnam War, and this would cause the discovery of collapse radiation. Collapse radiation is a highly radioactive biological substance that collapses genetic material. This leads to biological victims to be inflicted with the Urosky low emission infectious disease, or ELID for short. Should they not die immediately, the ones who reach the late stages of infection would have their muscles degrade, but their bones would become as hard as steel, morphing them into something monstrous. This ends up being something similar to the Resident Evil zombies. When the United States and the Soviet Union discovered that it was their Relic weapons that caused this, they agreed to the Relic Arms Limitation Treaty, which banned Relic weapons, and all existing Relic weapons must be dismantled. The two nations then worked together to cleanse the world of the ELID. Afterward, the United Nations expanded the Relic Arms Limitations Treaty into the Relic Technology Convention, which led to controlled practices of how relics were studied. Most existing relic technologies were sealed away permanently, and it became illegal to create relic weapons worldwide. During this, the Soviet Union collapsed, and relic research in that nation was halted while the power vacuum existed. The United Nations created a new agency, the United Nations Relic Agency, UNRA for short. This is to police and prevent any violations of the Relic Technology Convention. Additionally, the agency would resume relic research with the intent of benefiting mankind globally. This led to the Black Lily and White Rose Project, an attempt to learn more about relic civilization. This led to the creation of something called the human Gavirol hybrids to create organic keys to interact with relics in a more natural way. As an aside, keep the terminology key in mind because it will come up a lot in later episodes. Overall, this project would lead to strong discoveries. but ultimately failed as these experiments could not interact with relics. Sometime later, a massive hollow was revealed in the Antarctic polar ice caps, leading to the largest relic site ever recorded in human history. The UNRA diverted all of their attention to the Antarctic hollow to investigate. All researchers of the Antarctic hollow were genetically altered to resist the effects of ELID, and developed a research base on top of the relic site. This became the largest base ever made on Earth, and practically became a self-sustaining city. Director Raider Albert Rosartre was in charge of this research. Rosartre is, with no exaggeration, the most pivotal figure in the entire series, and you will find out why in just a moment. Many nations were researching relics, and China was one of them. This led to the Beilan Island incident back in year 2030, where a bunch of kids managed to break into a research site in Shanghai. These group of kids then ran into the ELID infected that were being quarantined in the site. A special force unit were dispatched to rescue the children and then contain the threat. To do this, the unit used explosives on the front gate to barricade the infected. However, this caused the collapse fluid to leak out of their containers, and with exposure to the heat, this caused a massive explosion of untold proportions. Everything and everyone within the immediate vicinity was evaporated in an instant, and Beilan Island became an uninhabitable black zone. The collapse fluid that was housed in the research site was then spread airborne, and any canisters that were holding the fluid were ejected across the eastern hemisphere. This caused any area that the fluid landed within become filled with collapsed radiation. This killed over 400 million people within the first hour, and many quarantine zones were established as a result. The Beilan Island incident split the world, with untainted land concentrated north and south of the equator. Massive refugee waves and ELID infections forced nations to redraw borders. Rosartre was in the city of Hong Kong during this time, so he saw firsthand the damage this caused. He initially believed the global powers would come together to restore the world, but that belief soon eroded. The Beilan Island incident effectively blasted China off the map, with the death toll reaching well over 870 million. While the UNRA tried their best to fund and develop green zones and refugee camps across the world, many of them outright fell apart. Korea also suffered, its death toll rising over 10 million. The United States exacerbated tensions by enforcing a military lockdown on Korea's border, barring North Korean evacuees. This sparked the Second Korean War, as North Korea shelled South Korea to force entry. In Japan, things weren't much better. Japan became a haven for refugees as they avoided most of the collapsed radiation. The US stationed troops to maintain order, causing overcrowding and unrest. The Japanese cabinet, backed by the US, banned further refugees, and also expelling the UNRA, the ones who were leading the relief effort. Finally, in the US itself, collapsed fluid capsules landed on the Pacific, drifting to North America. Private companies in Salt Lake City and Phoenix brute forced these capsules open, causing explosions on the scale of Beilan Island. Salt Lake City was wiped out entirely, and areas like Denver, Kansas, the British Columbia, and the Yukon became red zones. Survivors fled eastward, but mass hysteria and bureaucratic meddling denied many entries to green zones. The Pentagon built the North American Exclusion Wall, a 2,300-kilometer barrier from Winnipeg to Port Arthur, leaving countless survivors to die in contaminated zones. The UNRA abandoned evacuation efforts in the US, overwhelmed by the nation's self-inflicted chaos. But while all that was bad, it was significantly worse in Europe. Since Asia took the biggest hit, many of the Asian population were seeking refuge in Europe. This caused Europe to be fiercely overpopulated, which caused low resources. This also caused crime to increase several-fold, while an extreme amount of Europeans protested against the intake of refugees. This resistance caused the refugee effort to not come fast enough when winter rolled around, which was a lot colder than usual thanks to the lack of fuel. Many refugee shelters were not supported, and the people who were trying to survive slowly froze to death. The ones who were barred entry didn't even stand a chance. And finally, in Russia, the Beilan Island incident caused a political shift, as many of the neo-Soviets rose to power and staged an uprising. They took advantage of the chaos and rallied the people to one political party. By the time the Russian Federation knew what was going on, the neo-Soviets had already taken over and re-established themselves. This caused a major and bloody civil war, and by the end of it, the neo-Soviets came out on top. Rosartre himself also endured a traumatic encounter. While the UNRA was exiled from Japan, he remained in defiance. This did not work out, as the refugees soon realized they had been abandoned. They either made or stole weapons to fight back. When mass violence broke out, Rosartre was forced to flee. But during this time, the Japanese Self-Defense Force found a young girl, Kawasaki Kazusa, and it was discovered she was immune to Elid. All focus shifted towards this girl, as Rosartre and the few remaining UNRA staff members grouped together to take in this miracle girl. While Rosartre took her in, he explained to her clearly that she could spend the rest of her life in a lab, but she could also be the catalyst that could save the entire world. Kawasaki accepted this situation. However, rumors spread about this girl. While some saw her as a miracle that can save them, many others believed she was a monster who was somehow involved with this disease, and these people took up arms in attempt to kill the girl. Rosartre's final followers protected him and the girl as best they could, but unfortunately, as they were running away, Kawasaki was hit by a stray bullet. By the time they escaped Japan, she was already dead. Despite her death, Rosartre took her in to Russia for study anyway, and it was concluded that had she survived, it was very likely she would have died anyway. Studies revealed her immunity was more like a mutation. She had required to live in contaminated zones, as her body required collapse radiation to survive. Without this, her body would have decayed. The question after was, how could they turn this into a cure? Well, her death would have made it impossible to figure that out. After all of this, Rosartre felt something stir inside him. During the winter in Europe, he looked out his window and saw a young girl collapse to the ground and slowly die to the freezing weather. As he saw this play out, he finally snapped. All of his hope was gone. Humanity was no longer worth saving and deserved to suffer. So instead of trying to save mankind, they should instead prepare for when humanity destroyed itself and rise from the ashes. Between years 2031 and 2033, he wrote a very long report called the Beilan Island Incident Investigation Report. This detailed his personal experiences during the fallout of the Beilan Island incident, as well as notating all of the wrongdoings and selfish behaviors of all nations. He then detailed his theory that another world war was coming to fight over resources and territory, and no one would be able to stop it. He proposed that from the ashes, the survivors of humanity must come together as one global government without borders. Once this report was completed, he sent it across the world through the internet and left one final audio log stating that he believed a new humanity would rise from the approaching long night. It was then believed that he took his own life. His report birthed Rossartrism, a political ideology embraced by millions, including those in power, advocating for a united humanity post-catastrophe. Their running mission statement would be to become a shining beacon in the brave new world. Unfortunately, this did not stop a group from researching a relic site again in 2035. Coined as the Northern Lights Incident, research gone wrong caused a second explosion. While not as devastating as the first, this caused irreparable damage in Northern Europe. The Americas, largely unaffected, refused refugees, leaving the EU to fend for itself. This caused the EU to invade Africa in 2037, colonizing Libya, and by 2041 controlled the continent. The US quelled the Latin American alliance in 2038, maintaining oppression in South America, while a movement to tear down the North American exclusion wall fueled unrest. With the world breaking down around them, Rosartre's prediction was slowly coming true. Global trust eroded, with nations becoming hostile after failed peace talks. In 2044, the Neo-Soviet Union and the US left the United Nations, causing its full collapse. Germany fell into civil war, which drew the Neo-Soviets to get involved in an attempt to take out both sides. This pulled the EU, and after much persuasion, eventually the US got into the conflict, causing World War III to begin. From the years 2045 to 2051, this war consisted of ICBMs, nuclear airstrikes, and ground battles to control territory. With the world already devastated from irradiated zones, this made the world even more inhospitable. Furthermore, manpower was at an all-time low across the board, but it was especially bad in Europe thanks to the Northern Lights incident. This caused using robotics for war to become increasingly popular, if not necessary for all nations. The Soviets invested the hardest, and eventually they would make the first iterations of tactical dolls, or T-dolls for short. Through T-dolls, the Soviets were able to sustain themselves just long enough for the war to very suddenly come to an end. A unanimous call for peace emerged. The US, EU, and Neo-Soviet Union signed a peace treaty to enforce a global ceasefire. Make no mistake though, there was no victor in this war. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died worldwide, and much of the land was ruined due to nuclear warfare. This war ended by necessity. Europe in particular was in a hellish state. Between the poor land and irradiated zones, it was possible, if not very likely, that the population could literally starve to death. With all of the incidents, as well as the war, the citizens' morale was tapped out. Unwilling to rebuild, they turned to unrest with warlords and rebels rising. Governments, reeling from the war, hired private military contractors to quell the chaos. Rebels armed with military weapons left from the war inflicted heavy PMC casualties. The doll research industry, abandoned by governments focusing on restoration, supplied PMCs with T-dolls to maintain numbers. T-dolls and PMCs became commonplace in maintaining order across Europe. One of these PMCs, and the one we care about the most, is the Griffin and Krueger private military contractor and security consultant company. The story calls it Griffin for short, so we'll go with that. Griffin was founded in 2053 under the leadership of the aforementioned Griffin and Krueger. Krueger was a former high-ranking military soldier that served in World War III. As such, he was a well-respected man with connections. Griffin, on the other hand, is shrouded in a lot of mystery, but it's believed he was a well-versed secret agent that worked for the British and America. And if that wasn't enough, circumstances that we'll talk about later also gave them contact with leading doll researcher Javier Witkin, who is also the founder of a company called the Important Operations Prototype Manufacturing Company, also known as IOP. With these three factors combined, a plan was concocted to bring this new PMC into the limelight by garnering favor through doing jobs that the military or police could not do, with the use of female T-dolls who look closer to humans. Thanks to dolls being used to quell rebellion, they were not favored by the European public. but the founders believed this strategy of using dolls that look significantly closer to human and even have human-like personalities would sway public opinion and lead them to dominate the competition. And they weren't wrong. Over the next 10 years, Griffin became the most favored PMC in Europe. In 2062, the story of Girls Frontline begins, set in a world scarred by relics, collapse radiation, and human folly, where T-dolls and PMCs like Griffin fight to maintain order in a fractured society on the brink of collapse. That's the end of episode 0. Thank you to all of my members on YouTube and Patreon. You guys, as always, are awesome. If you enjoyed the video, consider hitting the like button and subscribing. I'll see you next time.